perspective that he's one of the most important intellectuals of our generation who can speak from the Indian case to both issues in the West, and increasingly, I'm sure he's gradually aware that his work is becoming influential in East Asia as well, as people find concepts like political society and derivative discourse and things like that quite usable. So without taking up more of his time, he has 40 minutes. Let me give you Partha Chatterjee.
Thank you, Prashanjit, and I have to thank the organizers of this conference for essentially arm twisting me to come here. But I'm extremely happy. I'm extremely happy to be here. It's been very pleasant, and this is a wonderful gathering. What I'm going to talk about is a new project that I'm beginning, and so this is sort of like a preliminary statement of the central problem that I want to address. So it is, in fact, very fortunate that the broad theme of the conference fits what I have been thinking about recently. So here it is. So my talk is called "When Victims Become Rulers: Hindu Refugees in West Bengal and Tripura." People forced to migrate from their homelands because of natural, economic, or political disasters are, for good reasons, regarded as victims of events for which they were not directly responsible. In many cases, they become impoverished and helpless. Some lose their lives. Many end up in miserable conditions in refugee camps. However, we also have instances, some of which will be discussed during this conference, of victims of forced migration managing to pick up the pieces and building new lives in new lands. This process, the strategies that victims adopt, the hurdles they surmount or circumvent, will be analyzed in several of the papers that will be presented here. They will illustrate what has been called the force of life by the organizers of this conference. Today I will talk about the case of Bengali Hindu refugees from East Pakistan who came into the Indian states of West Bengal, Assam and Tripura in several waves following the partition of British India in August 1947. They were rendered homeless because of the political consequence of the settlement, by which the end of British rule was accompanied by the creation of two sovereign states of India and Pakistan on the basis of a territorial division according to the principle of religious majorities. Most refugees were effectively expropriated. Nevertheless, within 2 decades, one section among them, namely those belonging to the educated upper castes, was firmly established within the socially and politically dominant strata in West Bengal. In Tripura, the Bengali refugees reduced the indigenous tribal population of the erstwhile princely state to a mere 30% of the population. The state is now thoroughly dominated by the former refugees. In Assam, on the other hand, while Bengali Hindu refugees are concentrated in a couple of districts, they have a somewhat embattled status as a cultural minority. I will not treat the question of the force of life involved in this story in its metaphysical sense. Rather, using archival sources, I will focus on the ideological and cultural strategies that were, in my view, crucial to the emergence of a refugee group as part of the ruling political formation in West Bengal and Tripura. The force of life here is entangled with historical transformations of social and political power, with new victors and victims. In the interest of full disclosure, I should mention that both my parents were upper-caste Hindus from eastern Bengal. I grew up surrounded by relatives who were refugees from East Pakistan. Many lived in refugee colonies in the suburbs of the city of Kolkata. I was deeply conscious of the fact that I was a Baal, the pejorative term that the people of West Bengal used for us and which we in turn displayed as a badge of honor. A lifetime of study of the history and culture of Bengal has, I hope, afforded me some distance to attempt a critical analysis of the doings of my own people in their land of domicile. Let me begin with the present. One of the peculiarities of public life in West Bengal is that while there is much talk about caste discrimination and caste politics in other parts of India, any mention of caste practices in West Bengal is virtually taboo. It is not acceptable in polite urban conversation to bring up the topic of caste, and one who does so is deemed either not to be civil enough to know that such things are not talked about among genteel folk, or to be deliberately rude and provocative. Those doing field research in West Bengal feel a sense of embarrassment when they have to ask the question, what is your caste? It is as if caste has been relegated to the interior zones of the private, into which an outsider should have no legitimate access. In the field of electoral politics, while the demands of the Muslim minority are often an issue on which parties and leaders have taken positions, especially in recent years, demands of caste groups, whether of Dalits or OBCs, have never figured in the political arena. In fact, from the extreme right of the political spectrum to the extreme left, no party in West Bengal is willing to discuss the contemporary caste system in the state. It could be argued that this is a mark of the success of the modernizing pedagogical project of Bengali intellectuals and social reformers since the 19th century. The absence of conversation about caste could mean that it has largely disappeared from the consciousness of the people of West Bengal. But there are many reasons to think that that is not the case. On the contrary, while practices of caste privilege and discrimination continue, their designations have been displaced on to other conceptual categories such as education and cultural accomplishment. That practices of caste privilege continue is easily demonstrated by the near complete dominance of the upper castes in virtually every political institution, including those where the leadership is elected, and in every modern profession. If one looks at long-term historical trends, there is something surprising about the prevailing structure of Hindu upper caste dominance, because it represents a sharp reversal of those historical trends. As in other regions of India, the initial dominance of upper caste Hindus in middle-class occupations during the colonial period did come under severe challenge in Bengal in the last 2 decades before independence. The rise of a new educated middle class from among the superior peasantry and popular political mobilization led to an assault on the institutions of upper caste privilege. But the consequence of independence and the partition of the province was that the erstwhile dominance of upper castes was re-established in West Bengal. The reversal happened during the lifetime of a single generation without anyone talking about it. A social counter-revolution took place behind a veil of silence. The social and political dominance in colonial Bengal of the 3 upper castes of Brahman, Boidya and Kayastha was based on their landed property and access to English education. The traditional Muslim nobility in Bengal did not take to English education in the 19th century. As a result, the Hindu upper castes were in command of public life in Bengal at the beginning of the 20th. The 1931 census shows that the upper castes were far more concentrated in the city of Calcutta than in the rural districts. Most among them were literate. The male upper caste population in the city was certainly overwhelmingly literate. Not only that, most were also literate in English. It is easy to conclude that the educated middle class professions were dominated by the 3 Hindu upper castes. This dominance came under challenge in the 1930s. With the spread of the Khilafat movement in the 1920s, Muslim peasants in the Bengal countryside, led by a new crop of Muslim mass leaders, began to be organized within the Congress. Under C.R. Das's leadership, the Swarajist Congress in Bengal forged a Hindu-Muslim pact by which it went into municipal elections with an understanding on sharing seats and official appointments between the 2 communities. After Das's death in 1925, the pact fell apart and the Muslim leadership gradually moved away from the Congress. In the 1930s, this rural leadership, located mainly in the eastern Bengal districts, began to organize Muslim tenants against landlords and moneylenders under the banner of the Krishak Praja Party. Further, the establishment of a university in Dhaka significantly increased the number of Muslim graduates in eastern Bengal and expanded the Bengali Muslim middle class. At the same time, the peasant mobilizations produced by the civil disobedience movement in the western districts of Medinipur, Hooghly, Bankura, Birbhum, and Bardhaman brought leaders from Mahisha, Shodgop, and other peasant castes into the district level of the Congress organization. But unlike in southern India or Maharashtra, there was no anti-Brahman movement in Bengal. In my view, there were two reasons for this. The first is that there were no dominant peasant castes in Bengal of any size or spread that could have made a significant impact on provincial politics. In an earlier essay, I have shown from the 1931 census figures that except for the Mahisho in Midnapur and Howrah, there was no numerical predominance of any single middle caste in any other district. There was no dominant caste in Bengal that could compare with, let us say, the Lingayat and the Vokkaliga in Karnataka, or the Vellala in Tamil Nadu, or the Kamma and Reddy in Andhra, or the Maratha in Maharashtra. Similarly, the Jat, Rajput, Ahir, or Gwala castes spread across several states of northern India that have given rise to the powerful political force of the Jat, Rajput, or Yadav movements of recent years have no parallel in Bengal. The second reason is connected to the first. The role of the dominant peasant caste in the transformation of provincial politics was played in Bengal by the Muslim peasant mobilization of the Krishak Praja movement. The attempt to oust the Hindu upper castes from their positions of privilege in landed property, political influence, and cultural dominance was launched in earnest in the 1930s. With the formation of the provincial ministries led by the Krishak Praja Party and the Muslim League after 1937, the dominance of the upper caste elites was under serious threat. In the Muslim-dominated districts of eastern and northern Bengal, they began to lose their traditional hold over the municipalities, the union boards, the bar associations, even their control over schools and colleges. Even in Calcutta, they had to make way for new Muslim claimants to positions in government offices, the Calcutta Corporation, and the Calcutta University. This is not dissimilar to the challenge to Brahmin dominance in southern and western India in the same period, except that it was a challenge mounted not against caste, but religious discrimination. Why partition? Before we look at how the partition of Bengal ended this challenge and re-established upper caste dominance on a new basis in West Bengal, we should briefly recount why the partition of the province took place at all. There is complete amnesia today in West Bengal on this episode of history. The prevailing common sense, repeated endlessly in textbooks and public oratory, is that the partition of Bengal was foisted on Bengalis by outside forces, the British, the All India Congress, and Jinnah. Yet the plain truth is that once it became clear in early 1947 that independence would be accompanied by a partition of the country, it was the Hindu political leadership of Bengal that demanded that their province must be partitioned. The upper caste elite was alarmed by the prospect of Muslim-majority Bengal joining Pakistan. Even the United Bengal proposal floated by H.S. Surawadi and Sharat Chandra Bose was quickly aborted when Shama Prasad Mukherjee, putting on his realpolitik glasses, pointed out that if on a future date the Muslim majority in a sovereign United Bengal voted to join Pakistan, what option would the Hindu minority have then? The option had to be exercised right now, namely by demanding the partition of Bengal with the Hindu majority districts, including Calcutta, joining the Indian Union. It is remarkable that the entire spectrum of Hindu political opinion in Bengal, from the Hindu Mahasabha on the right to all factions of the Congress to the communists on the left, were unanimous in 1947 on the necessity to partition Bengal. A public opinion survey published in the Amrita Bazar Patrika of 23rd April 47 showed that 98% of Hindus were in favor of dividing the province. One need not quibble about the scientific quality of the poll or the exact percentages reported. That Hindu opinion was massively against joining Pakistan and hence in favor of partition is beyond dispute. Apart from the blatantly communal arguments, there were sophisticated arguments that insisted that it was the Indian Union that was more likely to uphold modern democratic traditions, launch social and economic development, and safeguard the rights of all communities. This was reflected in the telegram sent on 7th May 1947 to the Secretary of State for India in London by some of the leading lights of Bengal's intellectual world, including Jadunath Sarkar, Ramesh Chandra Majumdar, both historians, Meghnad Saha, the scientist, Shishir Kumar Mitra, the doctor, and Shuniti Kumar Chatterjee, the linguist, supporting the partition of the province. Those who opposed the partition of Bengal were the Muslims of the province. They were in favor of an undivided Muslim majority Bengal joining Pakistan, but even there, some Muslim intellectuals were doubtful about the feasibility of that proposal, suspecting that the Hindus of Bengal would not be persuaded to join Pakistan. Consequently, they envisioned a more homogeneous and realistic option as a more realistic option, and East Pakistan excluding the western districts. The influential East Pakistan Renaissance Society drew a map of Pakistan as early as 1943, in which the Hindu majority western districts were left out. To assess the significance of the re-establishment of Hindu upper caste dominance in West Bengal, it is necessary to realize that the threat to that dominance was not from a rebellion of the lower castes, but a political and social challenge from a mobilized Muslim formation. That is what was averted by partition. The two powerful social movements among the untouchable castes in Bengal in the 19th and 20th century were among the Rajbangshi and Namoshudra communities. The Namoshudra movement acquired a distinct political stamp in the last years before independence by its association with B.R. Ambedkar's Scheduled Castes Federation and its alliance with the Muslim League. This political strategy, crafted by Jogendranath Mondal, made sense only in the context of the 3 or 4 East Bengal districts where the Namoshudra community was numerous. It made little sense in the rest of Bengal. Only 5 of the 30 scheduled caste members of the Bengal Assembly voted against the partition of the province. With partition and the separation of Hindu majority West Bengal, Mondal's strategy no longer made sense even in Pakistan. Barely 3 years after independence, he resigned from his position in the Pakistan cabinet and moved to West Bengal. Partition and the coming of the refugees. Unlike in the Punjab, there was no significant violence that accompanied the partition of Bengal. Hindus, who constituted about 28% of the population of East Bengal, came to West Bengal in fits and starts over a long period. The most reasonable estimates suggest that between 1947 and 64, about 7 to 8 million Hindus came to West Bengal, about 1 million to Tripura, and 1.5 million to Assam. In the other direction, about 1.5 to 2 million Muslims went from West Bengal to East Pakistan. The reason that prompted most Hindus to leave their homes in East Bengal was not so much actual violence, but the fear of violence. More commonly, Hindu refugees reported facing daily harassment and intimidation from their Muslim neighbors and local political leaders. They were told, they said, that Pakistan had been created as a land for the Muslims and that Hindus should go and join their co-religionists in India. There was a subtle class angle to this threat. The social dominance of upper caste Hindus in East Bengal was firmly based on their disproportionate control of landed property and command over the rents, produce and labor of Muslim and lower caste peasants. The political transformation of 1947 was seen by many as the prelude to the end of Hindu landlordism. True enough, Zamindari landed property was abolished in East Bengal in 1950, capping at least 2 decades of sustained campaign by Muslim peasant organizations. When the bigger landlords chose to move to India, smaller property owners among the Hindus felt even more insecure. Most Hindus who came to West Bengal as refugees were effectively expelled from their landed properties. The government response to the coming of refugees from East Bengal was quite different from that in the Punjab. The policy of the government of India, largely supported by that of West Bengal, was to offer nothing more than emergency relief to refugees and to persuade them to return. Any offer of resettlement would, it was felt, simply encourage more Hindus to leave East Bengal. Talks between Indian and Pakistani officials at various levels confirmed this position. But when in July 1948 several thousand refugees landed at Shialda station in Calcutta with nowhere to go, the West Bengal government was forced to rethink. Camps were opened at various places to house these refugees. But soon a new phenomenon appeared, that of the refugee colony, which posed entirely new problems. The first migrants to Calcutta and its suburbs included wealthy Hindu families who already owned or could afford to buy property. On 15th August 1947, the day of India's independence, an advertisement in a Bengali daily published from Calcutta called for applications from those who were coming to West Bengal in search of security and who wanted to build homes in the countryside in the vicinity of agricultural land. Such land was available in Burdhaman district, about 85 miles from Calcutta. Advertisements like this from land development companies would multiply in the following months. More interesting were newspaper advertisements seeking exchange of property between locations in East and West Bengal. Apart from land and residential buildings, exchanges were sought for shops, gardens, cinema halls, and in a few cases for proprietorship over entire villages, including hundreds of tenants. Another group of relatively affluent migrants were professionals who could expect to start new careers in Calcutta. Many, in fact, were already working in middle-class occupations in the city, but who now chose to wind up their homes in East Bengal and move the entire family to the west. This constituted the first group of migrants who had enough resources to resettle themselves. The second group were educated refugees who did not have such resources but were only equipped for middle-class occupations. We will have much more to say about them. The third group were artisans such as weavers, makers of shell bangles and idols for worship, who were left without a clientele in East Bengal after the well-to-do Hindus left. Many of these craftspeople were able to establish their trades in new locations in West Bengal, sometimes with government support, but often without. Finally, there were agriculturists, mostly from the untouchable Nomoshudra and Pondro castes. Some of them were initially housed in refugee camps set up by the West Bengal government. The intellectual leaders voicing the claims of East Bengal refugees did indeed have a certain vision of themselves as colonists in a new land. Jadunath Sarkar, the doyen of Indian historians, drew a contemporary analogy that might seem extraordinary today, but was quite widely shared among educated refugees at the time. Speaking at a conference of East Bengal refugees in August 1948, he said, I'm quoting from Jadunath Sarkar, "Palestine under Mohammedan rule was a poor desert country with an ignorant, impoverished, half-civilized population leading a sort of animal existence and dying of disease, dust and hunger like neglected cattle. Then 40 years ago, Jews began to buy plots of land from their Arab owners, and by introducing roads, schools, hospitals, fruit cultivation, and an honest police, turned the desert into a garden. When the Jews have fought and won their national state in Palestine, it will have become an advanced post of modern progress in the Near East, a spark of light in the midst of the mess of Muslim misgovernment and stagnation. Eastern Bengal is going the way of Palestine without the Jews. We must make our West Bengal what Palestine under Jewish rule will be, a light in darkness an oasis of civilization in the desert of medieval ignorance and theocratic bigotry. It is hugely ironical that Jagannath Sarkar was saying this in 1948, the year of the Nakba, or the great expulsion of Palestinians from their homelands. But well into the 1950s, educated refugees from East Bengal often referred to themselves as the Notun Yehudi, the new Jews, victims of persecution starting a new life as colonists. A popular Bengali film by that name, made in 1953, sealed the analogy. The refugee colonies. To increase their chances of employment, educated refugees from the Hindu upper castes needed to live close to the city of Calcutta. They found the conditions in the government refugee camps completely unacceptable. They were left with no alternative but to forcibly occupy public lands. The first targets were the abandoned barracks and grounds used by American soldiers during World War II. They then took over unutilized lands owned by government agencies. As the next step, they occupied country houses and gardens in the outskirts of the city owned by wealthy landlords and businessmen. Most contentiously, they occupied lands owned by Muslims, some of whom were said to have left for Pakistan, and in other cases were allegedly intimidated to leave. Prafulla Chakraborty's study shows that these refugees from the educated classes were at first hesitant about squatting on property they did not own, and announced that they were prepared to pay a price that they could afford. But land prices in and around Calcutta had already gone through the roof. Beginning in the southern suburbs, several hundred squatter colonies, large and small, came up on the fringes of the city, stretching some 60 or 70 miles north. On these lands, the colonists used their own labor and resources to build dwellings of varying degrees of permanence. Needless to say, the landowners went to court. Some employed armed musclemen to evict the squatters. In response, resistance built up in the refugee colonies. The government was put in a bind. Landlords asked, was there to be no security or private property in independent India? On the other hand, the refugees in the colonies realized that without mounting a political campaign, they would be unable to hold on to their precarious dwellings. Initially, they found among the people of West Bengal a large measure of sympathy for their plight. But with the spread of forcible occupations of land, that sympathy evaporated. This is where the role of the United Central Refugee Council, UCRC, became crucial. Consisting of socialists, communists, and other members of the left, the UCRC emerged as the principal organization directing the movement of the squatter colony refugees for about 5 or 6 years. Despite belonging to different political parties, the UCRC leaders, all refugees themselves, agreed to subordinate their party loyalties to the united cause of the refugees. Its strength came from a democratically elected structure rising from the level of each refugee family to the entire colony, up to the higher echelons of the organization. At the level of the refugee colony, meetings and demonstrations were a daily affair, since everyone realized that even a momentary lapse in vigilance could result in their being evicted. Until 1953, the participation in the movement of the refugees of the colonies was total. After daily meetings and processions in the colonies, a rally would be held every few days in the heart of Calcutta. 3 or 4 processions consisting of thousands of refugees would converge on the esplanade or in front of the Legislative Assembly or even the Chief Minister's house. There they would break the police cordon and court arrest. This routine, carried out repeatedly over months, produced a disciplined organizational machinery and the techniques for operating it efficiently. The chief demand of the UCRC was that the right of the refugees to live in the colonies must be recognized. In other words, it refused to accept any promise of resettlement. The refugees, it said, were prepared to pay for the land they had occupied as long as the price was within their means. It also argued that the refugees had actually improved these unoccupied lands by clearing them and making them habitable, and had with their own resources built houses, roads, tanks, and schools. It was the refugees, not the landowners, who had increased the value of the land. But the UCRC leaders soon realized that the particularistic demand of the refugees was not cutting much ice. It was openly being said in West Bengal that these outsiders were occupying the lands of the locals. Soon they would threaten the food supply, jobs, and houses. In early 1949, the UCRC changed its demands. Instead of justifying the forcible occupation of land by squatters, it demanded that landlordism itself be abolished in West Bengal and that the government take steps to curb speculation in land. This was not merely the demand of the refugees, it said, but that of all ordinary people of West Bengal. In this, the UCRC was merely emphasizing a demand that the Congress itself had made since the late 1930s. The abolition of landlordism and enactment of land reforms had been put on the agenda by Nehru's government. The UCRC demand that and its persistent campaign put pressure on the government in West Bengal to enact laws to this effect. As far as the colonies were concerned, the UCRC succeeded in forcing the government to agree that the refugees could stay in their colonies. The government effectively took over the ownership of the colonies by paying hefty sums in compensation to the landowners and accepting the refugees as tenants. But the historical success of the UCRC occurred on a far larger scale. The cultural ideological force of dominance. Let me come to my central argument. I will have to be somewhat schematic and often hypothetical, since there is so little reliable empirical evidence on macro-level caste structures in contemporary West Bengal. First, the refugees in the squatter colonies were mainly educated upper-caste Hindus who had been small rentiers, traders, or white-collar employees in East Bengal. With their emigration from East Bengal, they were effectively expropriated from the land. In West Bengal, on the other hand, zamindari abolition was carried out through legal and administrative methods without the backing of a political movement. As is well known, this left numerous loopholes through which proprietors were able for a long time to retain their control over land and local power. Because of this crucial difference in the way in which landlordism was abolished in the two parts of Bengal, its consequence was not merely a restoration, but a new formation of the middle class in West Bengal, one part retaining its ties to rural landed property and the other becoming purely urban. There are many accounts of daily life in the refugee colonies recorded by their inhabitants. Apart from the constant fear of eviction and the struggle to find an acceptable livelihood that would allow them to maintain some sort of veneer of respectability, a dominant theme that emerges is the overwhelming importance of education. Every colony has its schools for boys and girls. Soon some acquired their own undergraduate colleges. The education of refugee women and their employment in offices, schools, stores, hospitals, and other institutions was a major aspect of social change in urban Bengal in the 1950s and 60s. They were also participants in political demonstrations, although few rose to a position of leadership even at local levels. Despite the differences in economic opportunities, the new urban lives of all upper-caste migrants were radically sundered from the traditional patterns of rural life in East Bengal, which were deeply shaped by caste and communal relations. Most urban refugees no longer owned landed property, nor were they serviced by attached labor. The fact that refugee colonies tended to be roughly homogeneous by caste and the district of origin only naturalized the solidarity of common loss and struggle. The discriminations of caste practice in rural society receded into a distant memory and were not transmitted to the next generation. Those growing up in the refugee colonies of Calcutta and its suburbs had no conception of what it meant for the upper caste Munib or Korta, the master, and his family to be serviced by the Nomoshudra or Muslim tenant. They encountered in the city a different service population of poor migrants from Bihar and Orissa, many of whom were upper caste themselves and who jealously protected their own cultural claims to ritual purity. For the younger generation of East Bengal refugees, therefore, the understanding of the Chotolok, or the lower orders, was no longer exclusively or even prominently denominated by caste and religion. Indeed, they would have had little difficulty in imagining their position to be that of propertyless workers, struggling like others to find a livelihood in the city. Second, while those in the refugee colonies were predominantly from the upper castes who took shelter in the government refugee camps, those who took shelter in the government refugee camps were mostly from the untouchable laboring people, principally the Nomoshudra. The camps were hurriedly put up in abandoned buildings and lands used by the Allied forces during the war. Many left these camps at the earliest opportunities because the conditions were terrible. Those who continued to live there were in fact the most helpless, lacking the resources or will to move out of their condition of abject dependence. Third, what is incontrovertible is that the refugee movement of the 1950s, voicing mainly the demands of upper caste refugees in and around Calcutta, was a major pillar of the rise to electoral power of the left parties, especially the communists. Joya Chatterjee has shown that in the 1967 elections, after which the Congress was replaced by a United Front government, a sizable proportion of the victorious candidates of the left came from constituencies that had large refugee populations. Alongside the organization of white-collar workers in government and private offices, this opened up a new mobilization of urban middle class and a new crop of mainly upper caste leaders of the left parties. These leaders were very different from those of the peasant movements in the districts or the industrial trade unions, but they came to exercise considerable influence over the parties of the left. Fourth, until the 1970s, the upper caste formations in the western districts of Bengal did not undergo the same radical dissociation from the land or the traditional structures of rural dominance as did the uprooted upper castes from the east. This, I am claiming, had a major influence on the way in which the new leadership from the Eastern Bengal refugee sections actually took over the leadership of the left parties through the 60s and 70s. Sixth, I'm just skipping a little bit. The emergence of a progressive modern political idiom devoid of any association with caste or region facilitated the displacement of bhadra or respectable status from the upper caste identity to the insignia of education and the standardized genteel culture of Calcutta. There is an entire cultural history that remains to be written of the emergence in post-independence Calcutta of the standard language of polite society, one that has shed all traces of rural roots in the various district dialects and even of the old urban accents of traditional Calcutta. It is a language of respectability and a genteel lifestyle that goes with it, that is, as it were, nobody's patrimony, but one that each person has to acquire through learning in order to become bhadro or respectable. Such is the power of this cultural construct that even Bangladesh has adopted it as the standard language of polite communication. It serves to make urban middle-class respectability something that is earned rather than inherited. In principle, it makes the status open to all. Finally, all of these features of the new middle-class formation indicate the creation of a dominant culture that is, in Antonio Gramsci's sense, hegemonic. It offers a cultural repertoire that claims to be the normative standard for Bengalis from all regions and social rank, one that is open to all to acquire and use. Indeed, even non-Bengali residents of the state are invited to learn the skills of the high Bengali culture in order to be included in the ranks of the Bhadro. One should note that unlike many other states of India, there have been no serious attempts in Bengal to impose a mandatory use of Bengali in secondary schools or universities. Instruction is carried out in English, Hindi, Urdu, Nepali, and several other languages. So, the interesting question then is, why is there no resistance to this hegemony? Can I take 5 minutes?
Sure.
This dominance cannot be explained simply by asserting that upper caste Hindus have conspired to block off all avenues of upward mobility for others. It is entirely true, of course, that government policies of refugee rehabilitation in the 1950s were strongly tilted in favor of upper caste refugees. Forced migration to Dandakaranya and the Andaman Islands were confined only to Dalit refugees. When some of them wanted to return to West Bengal after the formation of the Left Front government in 1977, they were violently repressed at Morichapi. But these decisions only show that the upper castes were able to protect and promote their particular interests. Why were the far more numerous middle and lower castes unable to push forward theirs? One must remember that of all states of India, West Bengal has the third largest proportion of Dalits to the population. If one adds the proportion of Muslims, a majority of the population of the state is either Dalit or Muslim. Therefore, to put the question the other way round, how are the numerically tiny upper castes, numbering around 10%, able to continue their political and social dominance in an electoral democracy based on universal franchise without an economic foundation in landed property or industrial and commercial capital? That is the peculiar problem posed by upper caste dominance in contemporary West Bengal. No dominant social group can produce a justificatory ideology and simply expect it to be embraced by subordinate groups. Besides, if the ideology achieves a position of hegemony, it does so without a substantial use of coercion. That is to say, the subordinate classes are made to give their consent to it more or less voluntarily. It is not as though the particular interests of the dominant group are thereby surrendered. On the contrary, they are promoted, but only by successfully presenting them as the general interest of society as a whole. How was this done by the upper caste elite in post-partition Bengal? It may be easier to see how the ideology of progressive political modernity, unmarked by region, caste, or religion, came to achieve hegemonic status by pointing out a few counterfactual instances of events that did not happen in West Bengal in the second half of the 20th century. The first was open conflict between the millions of migrants from East Pakistan and Bangladesh and the local residents of West Bengal. Cultural antagonism and prejudice between the regions west and east of the river Partha are no less deep than those between upper and lower castes or Hindus and Muslims. These were intensified by the sudden emergence of dense settlements of East Bengal refugees on forcibly occupied land in the vicinity of Calcutta. Upper caste refugees made claims on the limited and intensely competitive sector of urban white-collar employment. Agriculturist refugees moving into the border districts sometimes manage, through superior enterprise and farming skills, to displace local farmers from the land. While all this caused adverse reactions among the older settled population of West Bengal, they were rarely voiced in public. There is no doubt that the fact that the demands of the refugees were phrased by their leaders in the general terms of social and class justice and encompassed within a program of progressive economic and political change, and not as the claims of a particular ethnic group, went a long way in preventing the deep-rooted cultural divide from acquiring the form of a political conflict. One has only to compare the case of Muhajirs in Karachi or Palestinians in Jordan and Lebanon to realize what could happen when large groups of refugees concentrate at one place and organize politically to make claims on scarce local resources. The second development that did not take place in West Bengal was ethnic conflict against propertied businessmen and industrialists from northern India. Given the loss of Eastern Bengal and the democratic consolidation of a culturally homogeneous state, this might have been a populist option before the Bengali upper caste leadership. To provide a comparison, a violent movement to throw out propertied and prosperous Bengalis did occur in neighboring Assam in the early 1960s. Once again, the ideology of universalist modernity standing above narrow cultural divisions turned out to be of greater value to West Bengal's political leadership. Similarly, there was no pogrom against what might have been a much weaker target, namely the immigrant workers from Bihar, Odisha, and Uttar Pradesh. East Bengal refugees, even those belonging to the upper castes, were pushed into seeking employment in skilled and unskilled manual labor in both formal and informal sectors. Here they were in competition with migrant workers from other states. But unlike the Shiv Sena in Bombay, which launched its political career as champions of the Marathi people through violent conflicts against South Indian laborers, the political leadership in West Bengal, including that of the refugee movement, chose to stick to its ideological commitment not to encourage ethnic divisions within the working class. It had a greater stake in establishing its credential as upholders of the general interest. In short, the new elite culture created by upper-caste Hindu refugees became hegemonic precisely because it was not exclusively about caste or refugees. Its persuasive power came from its ability to create and defend larger social consolidations. Had it been only about caste dominance, a hypocritical attempt to cling on to age-old privileges, it would have been easily unmasked. This shows that it is impossible to make simple moral evaluations of hegemonic cultural ideological strategies. Their force in sustaining worthwhile and prosperous lives is deeply implicated in social transformations that create new structures of hierarchy and political power. I could end here. There's just a little comment I had to make about Tripura. I cannot go into the settlement of Bengali refugees in Tripura except to say that it was much more straightforwardly a story of colonization. Soon after the independence of India, Bengali Hindu refugees from the easternmost districts of Tripura, Kumilla that is, Noakhali and Chittagong, began to move into the princely state of Tripura. In 1949, Tripura joined the Indian Union. By 1964, an estimated 1 million Bengali refugees settled in Tripura. Today, of the 3.6 million inhabitants of the state, the indigenous tribal peoples number around 1 million, or about 30%, while Bengalis are about 2.5 million, or nearly 70%. Tripura has a predominantly agricultural economy dominated by Bengali cultivators. The indigenous people live mostly in the hills. There has been an insurgent movement in Tripura since the 1960s with periods of considerable violence. The Communist Party, which has been in power in Tripura for long periods, has attempted to bridge the divide between the immigrant and indigenous populations through its leaders among the tribal people and devolving local power through the Autonomous Hill Council. The political rhetoric of universalism and class alliance is similar to that used by the left parties in West Bengal. But while the political atmosphere is now largely peaceful, the sheer facts of demographic change that occurred in the princely state of Tripura following the partition of British Bengal in 1947 stare us in the face. Once again, the vision of colonization is clearly stated in an article published in a Calcutta daily in 1950 by a Bengali science professor. Bengal is a densely populated region, he pointed out, where large-scale resettlement of populations was virtually impossible. There was no alternative but to seek lands for carefully planned colonization. The article went on to argue that the state of Tripura had large tracts of fertile, uncultivated land in both hills and valleys, which would be ideally suited for the cultivation of food and commercial crops, as well as horticulture and animal husbandry. Significantly, Mitra stressed that in Tripura state, lands were not held in private property. Hence, it would be relatively simple to acquire large tracts of land that could be distributed among the refugees according to a carefully thought-out plan. Not once did he mention that the princely state was inhabited by indigenous people. As far as he was concerned, it was terra nullius, in the sense in which European philosophers and jurists regarded the Americas as uninhabited. I must confess that there is something deeply unsettling in seeing the 17th century colonization being reenacted in the middle of the 20th. But once again, judging by the full range of historical consequences, can we honestly insist that the victims of partition in 1947 should have made better choices in their precarious lives? That is the question I wish to explore in my research project. Thank you.